Ladies, gentlemen, non-binary and gender-fluid individuals, cyborgs, androids, interdimensional eldritch horrors, and raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles, and warm woolen mittens. Welcome to the Crushing Deep. As you may have noticed, my new animated intro has been finished, and I'm quite pleased with how it turned out. So, as promised, today I'll be doing a tutorial on how to animate bubbles realistically in Cinema 4D without any plugins, and when we are done, it should look something like this. So let's jump right in, and the first thing you're going to do is need to set up your scene. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this as that's not the main focus of what we're doing today, and if you have a specific project in mind you may have a scene set up already. If however you want to recreate what I've done exactly, then all you need to do is go online and look for an underwater HDRI. There wasn't a lot of choice, but I downloaded this lake bed looking image, created a plane of the same dimensions, applied a displacer to the plane, added a water shader to the displacer, and then set my camera above the plane looking down at it, switched the displacement type to RGB XYZ world, added a subdivision surface and then rendered it out as a 300 frame MP4 with a 30 frames per second frame rate with the same dimensions as the original image. Then, in my bubble project, I added a sky object, created a new material, switched off every channel except luminance and added my MP4 as a texture, and made sure to switch on animated preview. I then set the blur scale to 5 and the blur offset to 2, so that it looked as though the background was viewed through a haze of water rather than simply being a low resolution image, and the gentle distortions caused by the displacer helped sell that effect. Next, for the lighting, I simply followed Daniel Danielson's tutorial for underwater lighting, which you can find a link to in the description below, and then added a camera at the default perspective coordinates. But lowered it on the y-axis to 100 centimeters and increased the pitch angle to -6. I'm then going to add a protection tag to make sure we don't mess up this setup. Just to tidy up our UI a bit, I'm going to add a null object and rename it environment, and drop our sky object, the light, and our camera into it as children of the null, and collapse that group. Next, we need to alter our project settings and increase our frame range to 0 to 300 so that we really get enough time to see how our bubbles are behaving. I'm going to jump into our render settings and set the resolution to 1920 by 1080. And the frame rate to 30 frames per second. And the range from 0 to 300 to match the project settings. Okay, so now we have our scene all set up, let's start making our bubbles. First thing we're going to need is a particle emitter, so we go to Simulate, select Particle from the drop down menu, and then Emitter. If we hit play, we can see straight away all these little white lines appearing and heading off into the distance, and these are our particles. But they aren't anything like bubbles yet, because of course they're travelling in the wrong direction. So we can set the pitch on the object to 90 degrees and hit play, and now our particles are travelling upwards just like bubbles. The next issue we have is that our bubbles stop appearing halfway through, and I want them to be produced consistently throughout the animation, so we're going to change the stop emission field from 150 to 300. So now if we hit play, they keep going right to the end of the animation and in the right direction. But the spawning of them out of nothingness is not natural at all, so we need to fix that. Now we could model an object from which the bubbles issue forth, but we're going to cheat here and just lower our emitter out of frame to about -483 centimeters. Next, we're going to double the number of particles produced, switch it from 10 to 20, and double the size of the emitter from 100 to 200 centimeters squared. Next, we're going to check the lifetime of our particles. By default, they'll probably be 600 frames, but just in case it's set to a smaller number, make sure that it is set to at least 300 frames so that none of our bubbles randomly blink out of existence whilst we are watching. If you're making a scene with a higher range of frames that last longer, make sure that you increase this number to match whatever length your scene is going to be. Okay, so let's hit play again, and we can see now we have more bubbles, and they're traveling from below the screen right up past the top without stopping. But they're a bit too uniform to be natural, so let's mix things up a bit. First, let's double the speed to 300 centimeters and add in 25% variation, and set the end scale to 1.25 and add in 50% variation and hit play. Okay, now we can see that the bubbles are all travelling at slightly different speeds, which is a bit more realistic as bubbles don't travel upwards at uniform speed. It varies depending on the size of the bubble and the density of the water around it. Despite the variation, it still seems a bit uniform. All the bubbles are travelling straight up, but real bubbles drift to the side a little bit as well, as they're influenced by currents and changes in pressure. So we're going to add a turbulence object. I find the default settings here for turbulence just about right, as we don't want to alter the path of our bubbles too much. And so now if we hit play, and if you look really closely, you can see there is a tiny amount of drift in some of the bubbles. Okay, so if we pause this halfway through and hit render, we can see that we don't actually have any bubbles in our scene, and that is because we haven't told Cinema 4D what type of object our particles are supposed to be. So let's do that now. We do this by creating a sphere object, and you see the sphere here is way too big. We want to reduce that down in size to maybe a 20 centimeter radius, which is still pretty big for a bubble, but there is a reason why we're going large, and we'll come back to that later. The next thing we're going to do is want to change the type from standard to icosahedron, which redistributes the polygons to uniform sized triangles, which will help us out with as another step later on. So now we make this sphere a child of the emitter. Now in the editor you won't see any difference straight away, and that is because we need to go into the emitter and check this little box which says show objects. Some of you who are familiar with particle emitters may be tempted to hit the render instances button here as well, as it saves on performance, but it is very important that you don't switch on this option right now. Okay, so now if we hit play, we can see we have our basic bubble shapes rising up through the scene, and if we render it we can see we have sphere shapes, and also that they're slightly different sizes because we turned on the size variation on the emitter earlier on. Okay, so there's obviously still quite a lot of changes we need to make this look more realistic. So if we look at some reference footage of real bubbles, we can see that we have a cluster of big bubbles in the center, and then lots and lots of smaller bubbles all around. Now, we could increase the scale variation on our emitter, but currently there's nothing tying the variation in speed to the variation in size. So we could have tiny bubbles traveling faster than the big ones, which isn't what we want. So what we're going to do is select our emitter, copy it and paste it so that we have two. And then we're going to select the sphere in the emitter and half the radius from 20 to 10 centimeters. Then we hop into our new emitter and change the seed from 0 to 1 so that the bubbles spawn in different locations. Increase the birth rate to 40 and decrease the speed to 200. And finally extend the area from 200 to 250 centimeters squared. If we hit play now, we see our scene is getting much busier, and depending on your hardware you may have noticed the performance of your machine slowing down. To help with this, we're going to throw in a particle destructor, which can be found in the same drop down we got the emitter from. This will destroy the particles when they come into contact with it, so that your system is no longer calculating those particles. If we set this to 2000 centimeters wide and 2000 centimeters long, we'll leave the height at 200 and set the position on the y-axis to 500, and then the particles should be destroyed more or less as soon as they leave our field of view. Okay, so our bubbles still aren't small and numerous enough, so we're going to copy and paste the emitter again. Change the size of the bubble to 5 centimeters radius, and then in the emitter change that to 300 centimeters squared. We'll set the birth rate to 60 and the speed to 100, and increase the seed by 1 again. Then we'll do that again to make a fourth emitter of 350 centimeters squared, sending out bubbles with a 2.5 centimeter radius. Set the birth rate from 60 to 80 and the speed down to 50, and increase the seed one more time. Okay, so now our scene is pretty busy and chaotic, but there is one thing that's really wrong with how our bubbles are behaving, and if we stop it part way, we can see the bubbles are intersecting each other and maintain their shape as individual objects, which is not right. When our bubbles collide underwater, they should combine into one bubble and increase in volume. Luckily, there is a tool in Cinema 4D for precisely that. Metaballs. So let's go to Create, Modeling, and then select Metaball. This will put a Metaball object into our scene, but you won't see any difference straight away. What we want to do to get this working is to select our emitters and their children and drag them to become children of the Metaball. But now we have this weird crazy tube in the middle of our scene, which we don't want. So we are going to have to mess with some of the settings of the Metaball. The first thing we're going to want to do is decrease the editor subdivision to match the render subdivision at 5 centimeters. You won't immediately see a huge difference, but what this has done is just increase the frequency of the vertices to make a higher resolution object. Next, we want to increase the hull value. The higher the value, the more accurate the object, but it will be performance expensive. But there is a trick to avoid killing your PC. A Metaball works better with larger objects. We would have to turn up the hull value to max and the subdivision to something tiny to show all our little bubbles if they were of accurate size, which is why we made our bubbles oversized to begin with. By making our bubbles larger, we can use much more conservative values. So let's just set our hull value to 200%, and we can immediately see quite a big difference. But there's still a single column in the middle that we need to deal with. Here's where we cheat a bit and deal with our bubbles that are way too big. We go to the Metaball and set its scale to 0.5 on every axis. And now, if we hit play, our bubbles are an appropriate size and the Metaball works the way we want it to. Incidentally, if you're not seeing any bubbles at this stage, or maybe no more than 3 or 4, check you don't have render instances selected in any of your emitters, as this object doesn't work with the Metaball object, which is why I said not to turn it on earlier on. Okay, so by halving its size, our emitters have come back into frame. So we'll set the position of each of them to 0, and then lower the Metaball itself to -483. Okay, so we're nearly done, but I think we still need a lot more small bubbles to make this look realistic. But how can we do that? If we add too many to our Metaball, it's going to kill our performance. But if it's not in the Metaball, then we face the same problem of them intersecting each other. So there's one more trick we can do. So what we're going to do is to add one more particle emitter by copying the last one we made and pasting it again. But this time we're going to leave it out of the Metaball object. Make sure the position is set to minus 483 centimeters on the y-axis. Set the size to 350 by 350. The birth rate on this one is going to be way higher at 2000 particles, and the seed is going to be 75. We're going to increase the seed again, and we're going to alter the n scale to 2 and increase the variation to 100%. Since we aren't using our metaball for this one, we can turn on our render instances here. Then we're going to alter the sphere and decrease the radius to 1 centimeter and decrease the segments to 12, as at this scale there won't be a visible difference between low and high polygon spheres, and we want to keep our performance up. Then we're going to add a dynamics rigid body tag to the sphere to stop them from intersecting with each other. We're going to head into the force section and change the follow position from 0 to 0.5, and what this does is compel the object to head back to its set position and along its predetermined path after a collision is finished. By keeping the value low, it should help to keep it look natural. Then we're going to add a collider body tag to our metaball, and in collision set the shape to moving mesh. Now we're going to copy the sphere in our new emitter and paste it 2 more times. Change the radius to 0.5 centimeters in one and 0.25 in the other, and adding both as children to our final emitter. This will cause the emitter to make 1/3 of its particles 1 centimeter, and 1/3 0.5 centimeters, and 1/3 0.25 centimeters. Plus the variation we added in the emitter itself will cause a lot of randomness, and none of the particles will ever intersect. If we hit play now, you won't see any of the particles appearing. Why is this? Gravity. If we come out of our set camera and look down, all of our particles are falling down because we added physics when we added our rigid body tag. So to fix this, we go to our project settings and into dynamics. You'll see by default gravity is set to 1000. Just switch that to 0 and hit play again. Jump back into our camera and play again, and all of our bubbles are now rising as we want. But with the collisions and turbulence, some of our particles are flying off to the side, even with our follow position turned on, and that's not how bubbles behave. So we're going to add a gravity object for the particles. I know it seems counterintuitive to add gravity when we've just turned it off, but if we use the particle gravity, we can set it up in such a way that it pulls the particles up rather than down, and so that it only affects the particles that are drifting away from the main group. To do that, first we set the acceleration to minus 250 so that the force is up rather than down. Then we go to the fall off and set the shape to cylinder, the size to 400 by 2000 by 400, and then click invert. Then set the Y position to 500 centimeters. Now, every particle inside that cylinder is unaffected by the gravity, but as soon as a particle drifts outside the area, it starts being pulled upwards. Next, we're going to add an attractor. This is an object that pulls particles towards it. The gravity is great at making sure the bubbles continue to rise when they've been knocked off course, but it doesn't stop their sideways trajectory, so the attractor will pull the particles back towards the middle. We don't want to interfere with their upward trajectory though, so first we're going to set the position to 500 on the y-axis so that it draws the particles upwards as well as inwards. Next we're going to increase the strength to 2000 and decrease the speed limit to 250. Then we're going to do the same trick as we did with the gravity in the fall off by setting the shape to cylinder, the size to 300 by 2000 by 300 and inverting it. Now all the particles in the middle will be unaffected, but any that drift out the side will immediately be drawn back towards the middle whilst continuing upwards. Finally, we need to add a material to our bubbles, so create a new material, turn off every channel except for transparency, reflectance and bump. In transparency, set the refraction preset to water, and then untick total internal reflection. This makes it so that the inside of the sphere appears hollow like a bubble of air in the water rather than a drop of water in the air. Then go to reflectance and add another layer of specular because the preset from the transparency makes the bubbles pretty hard to see. In the first specular layer, turn up the width to 72% and have the strength set at 20. And in the second layer, have the width at 20, the inner width at 15, and the strength at 100%. Next, in Bump, go to Surfaces and add Water as a texture. Open it up and set the U frequency to 0.25, the V frequency to 1, as well as the T and wind values. Apply this material to the spheres in your final emitter. The icosahedron configuration we used at the beginning will make sure the material doesn't pinch at the top. And add it to the metaball. You may want to switch the projection on the metaball to cubic and increase the tiles to 2 on the U and V axis. Now, if you render out the scene, it should look something like this. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll speak to you again soon.